Well, there was once a king, and he was a good king. He worked hard for the good of his people every day, through the weeks, past the months, into the years, until one day he woke up like he did every day. And he went over to the bowl of water that was waiting for him like he did every day. And he started to wash his face like he did every day. But unlike other days, a little wisp of the dream from the night before crept into his mind, and he stopped to ponder it. And when he turned back to the bowl of water, the water was still. And in that water, he saw his reflection. But it wasn't the face he expected to see. Crows had left footprints around his eyes. All those years of work had left worry down his forehead and laughter lines around his mouth. His neck looked like a turkey, and the once dark hair was now silver. And he realised that without noticing, he had grown old. Which he wouldn't mind, except he was a king. And he'd been so busy being a king, he'd never got married. He'd never found the right person. He'd never had any children. And so now, who was to be king or queen after him? And he looked around at all the people in his castle, from his advisors to the girl who turned the spit and the boy who blacked the shoes. No one of them seemed any more fit to be a king or a queen than anybody else. And he sat and he thought and he pondered, and he had an idea. He would hold a competition. And so he sent out the messengers far and near all through his kingdom to announce, on a such and such a day, you would come to the palace if you wanted to be the next king or queen. There would be a competition. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor. It didn't matter if you were male or female. It didn't matter if you were young. Well, you did have to be younger than him. That was the one condition. And so, as the day of the competition drew near, more and more people got closer and came to the palace, because everybody wanted to be a king or a queen. And all the wise men and women, they had come. Because surely you need to be wise and clever to be a king or a queen. And they sat sparring one another at chess, and sparring with swords and swordplay, with the wits of rapier riddles that I think Sheila's going to tell us some riddles later, so you better get that wit going now. And all the strong men and women, they had come too. And there were men and women wrestling to prove their strength. But it wasn't just the strong and the witty and the wise. Everybody had come, all dressed in their best clothes, with such a wonderful array of hats. And amongst everybody else, there was one small boy. Now, he had come in his best clothes too. When he looked around at everybody else, he didn't look so best anymore. He'd had a bit of a growth spurt, and they were a bit short at the wrists and the ankles, and a little bit ragged at the elbows. And he looked at all these strong and clever and wise people, and he could not think of a single competition that he could beat any of them at. And he was about to turn around and give up and go home, when suddenly a hush came down over the crowd. Everybody turned and looked at the palace, because coming out onto the parapets were the buglers, and they put their bugles to their mouths. The master of ceremonies, with his red jacket on, sucked the air into his chest and said, "Let the competition begin." The great oak doors of the castle opened, and there was the king himself. And he looked at all the people who were gathered there, and he held up his hand, and he said, "In my hand, I hold a bag of seeds. Anybody who would like to be the next king or queen, all you need to do is come before me, and I will give you a seed. You must look after it. You must care for it for 6 months. And at the end of that time, you must bring the fruits of your labours back to me, and then I will choose the next king or queen." Well, there was a bit of a muttering around the crowd. What sort of competition was this? To be a leader? Where was the battling dragons, or the climbing mountains, or the sword play, or the wit, or the plant a seed? But one person was very happy, the boy. His parents were farmers. If there was one thing he knew how to do, then surely it was plant a seed. And so he pushed and jostled with everybody else to get his place in the queue. And one by one, everybody went past the king, and the boy held up his hand. The seed was put into it. He pulled at his fingers around that seed, and he was off. He was running and running and running and running as fast as he could all the way home. He carefully took that seed and he put it onto a windowsill. And then he took a plant pot and he made the best compost that he could. He put stones at the bottom for a bit of drainage. He went and got some soil from his father's best field. He added some water. And then the secret ingredient. He went into the stables and he found a bit of old, soggy, squishy, perfectly rotted horse poo. That went in as well, and he mulched it all up together, made a little hole in the middle, dropped the seed inside, squished it all down, and then he found the perfect place that got the morning sun and the evening sun, missed the noonday heat. And then he went and washed his hands really well for 20 seconds, singing happy birthday. And then he did the hard part. He waited. And every morning he would run downstairs to see if anything was growing in that pot, a little white shoot or a little green sprout. And he didn't really expect anything for the first few days. But after a week went by, surely any day soon, every day there was nothing but a pot of dirt and horse poo. A month went by. He tried putting more water in the pot. He tried letting it dry out. He tried putting it in a place that got the noon sun. He tried putting it in the shade. Still, nothing but dirt and horse poo. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. The day of the competition arrived. And he went outside for one last look, and there was still nothing. Just dirt and horse poo. And he slouched down at the breakfast table, and his mum and dad looked at him and said, "Why aren't you in your best clothes? Isn't today the day of the competition?" "I'm not going." "Why not?" "Because I've got nothing to show." "But you've worked so hard for 6 months. What difference is one more day going to make?" Well, he had no answer to that. And so he put on his best clothes and he picked up the pot and he started to make his way towards the palace. And the closer he got, the more he slouched over that pot, because there were hundreds of people on the road and every single one of them had a pot. Some had pots with little tiny white flowers that smelled delicious. Others had big red, yellow, orange blooms. Some had long green trailing vines. Nobody else had a pot of horse poo, just him. And his feet got slower and slower until he was the last person to arrive at the palace. He got there just as the hush fell, just as the buglers came out onto the parapets. There was the master of ceremonies. "Let the judging begin." The great oak doors opened and there was the king. And everybody was pushing to be first past the king. And they all walked past, showing off their beautiful flowers and their vines. And the king nodded. And he smiled. And the more and more people went past, the more that smile got a bit faded around the edges. And he spent no more time with any one person than the next person, until there was only one person left. And the boy, right at the end of the queue, he had been waiting and waiting enough time to think what was going to happen to him, and thinking about what kings did to people that displeased them. And surely the king wouldn't be very pleased, that he wouldn't have thought he'd been taking the competition seriously enough, that he hadn't really tried, and kings did nasty things to people like that, like throw them in the dungeon door. And the boy was about to turn tail and run when he was pushed in front of the king. And he shuffled past as quickly as he could, trying to hide that pot, but not quickly enough. A hand came down and grabbed his shoulder and turned him around, and he looked up into the face of the king, who was smiling down at him. "You will be the next king." And the boy said, "But all those people, they had those beautiful flowers and vines and And the king, he started to laugh. He said, yes, they did, didn't they? I've no idea where they came from. Before I gave out those seeds, I took them and I boiled them for a day and a night. And the same thing happened to those seeds as would happen to you. All of those seeds were dead. Not one of them should have grown as much as a blade of grass. And yet, out of all the people here, you are the only one who had the bravery and the honesty and the courage to come before me with nothing but a pot of dirt and horse poo. And so you will be the next king.